I think the last two times I demonstrated here, it was first on the joiner's trade and secondly on the cabinet maker or furniture maker's trade. And there was a lot of interest expressed in the variety of planes that I used in those demonstrations. And so when Milt asked if I had anything up my sleeve, could I come talk again, I said, well, why don't I just elaborate on some of these planes and expand on that a little bit. So here we are tonight. Sooner or later, you guys have got to get tired of this stuff. But in the meantime, this is where we're at. So I've laid these things out on the table. It looks like a complete hodgepodge, I'm sure, but it's not. The organization on the table goes from the very basic planes that almost every woodworker would have in his toolbox to planes that are specialized for doing joinery, for cutting the joints to join pieces of wood together, to planes that are more specialized for decorative work, molders, etc. And then down here are a few oddballs that are, some of them are very specific to particular trades, some of them are just, they do a certain job very well, and I'll talk about those as we get to them, but they're a little bit peculiar and they don't really fit into one of those other categories. So we'll start back here with the very most basic. Oh, the other organization on the table is early stuff is towards the front, later stuff is towards the back. You notice the front of the table is all lined up with wood, the back of the table is all lined up with metallic stuff. With one weird exception, which I'll get to in just a minute, and that's these two guys here and their brethren, which I didn't bring up. This is maybe 10% of the collection of planes that I have.
There's a bill of just for
yeah.
planes.
And it was Jake, thanks to Jake, who helped carry all this stuff in. I hope we'll survive and help carry it all out.
It's only 10%.
Well, anyway, so
Good, how are you?
what's a plane? A plane is basically a jig for a chisel. There's nothing in principle that you can do with a plane that you couldn't do with a chisel. It's not practical to do a lot of the things that planes would do, and they refine a chisel in many ways. They come in a huge range of sizes. Everything from a little tiny plane that is no wider than my finger, and you kind of hold it between your finger and your middle finger, and push it with your thumb and your middle finger, push it with your index finger. Used by model makers, used by luthiers for hollowing out the backs of violins and things like that. Very fine little work. Well, the biggest plane that I know of or have had any experience with is a Cooper's joiner, and that's a plane that's about 6 feet long. It's mounted either clamped to the side or fastened to the side of a workbench or on a bipod so that it's slanted upside down, and you push the wood over it. You didn't hurt the plane, you push the barrel staves over it, and that's how the Cooper joined the barrel staves, so that when they stack them all up together, they make a round cask. Each one of those barrel staves leveled on both sides to make a round cask. Those are the two biggest planes I'm aware of. But there's a huge gamut between that little tiny thing and this 6 foot long thing, and there may be bigger planes in the world that I'm not aware of. I don't know. I don't possess to know all there is to know about planes. I don't think anybody ever will. Every time I pick one up and use it, I learn a little bit more. Anyway, history. Where did they start? Where was the first plane? There's no evidence, to my knowledge, that the early Egyptians had planes. They used hand adzes, and were very good at it, and they made some beautiful stuff with them. But there's no evidence there were of any planes in Egypt. The Greeks, we had very little woodworking from the Greeks. That stuff's all disappeared, and very little record of any of the tools that they used, and so on and so forth. But the earliest evidence for the existence of planes actually does come from Egypt. It comes from Egypt in that Some of the sarcophagi that they buried their mummies in, the mummy was laid on a bed of shavings which are clearly plane shavings. An adze and a saw make very different kinds of shavings than a plane. And these were very clearly plane shavings. But this was from the period when the Greeks occupied Egypt, the latter Egyptian period. The Greeks were already there. Homer doesn't mention planes or anything like them in any of his stuff. But by the time the Greeks were in Egypt, apparently planes were around. And we have no examples of them other than these shavings in, I guess, several of the sarcophaguses that have been unearthed from that time. So somewhere probably in the Periclean age of Greece, that's Greece's golden age, planes arrived, probably from somebody modifying a hand adze, using it backwards, finally adding a sole to it, and going on. The Romans, though clearly had planes. They had planes fairly early on. There are artifacts that came from the ruins at Pompeii. Some of them are in the museums in Britain. And the interesting thing about them is they had metallic planes. They had already put an iron sole on the bottom of their plane and encased it in iron. Very much, when you look at these rusty old artifacts, there are pictures of them. I've never seen them personally, but when you look at the pictures of them, they look like they were very much like the infill planes that Spears in Scotland or Norris in England made during the 18th and 19th centuries, and are still made today by many, many craftsmen. They are probably the epitome of the plane makers.
They actually use stone.
Pardon?
They actually use stone as a plane instead of metal, you saying? Did you have any record of actually having a stone wedge? As
No,
a
I've
plane?
never seen that.
Okay, gotcha.
No, the Romans ones, I don't think the wedges have survived. The infill is barely intact, but I expect it was a wooden wedge. They used wooden wedges, even the hand adzes. The Greek hand adzes, the Egyptian hand adzes. The Egyptian ones, the early Egyptian ones were bound with sinew of some sort and then shrunk like strips of leather that they bound the iron to the heft. There's a couple of Greek hand adzes around. They show an iron band and a wooden wedge that fastened the blade to the stock. I expect the Romans used wooden wedges with just a cross pin, very similar to some of the modern planes. But I don't know. I'm not an expert on this history. Okay, they disappeared during the Dark Ages, from the fall of the Roman Empire, 476 to around 1000 AD, and then they reappeared fairly early on in the Renaissance period. If you look at some of the old texts and stuff, you see, and some of the old artwork where they depict craftsmen, you can see planes either in use or at least sitting on a bench. So by the Renaissance period, planes were back in existence. I don't know if the early Renaissance ones were wood or metal. I wouldn't be surprised if they're wood. We went through a period there where metal seemed to disappear and wood became the issue. It became the most common form of making a plane. And for good reason. It works, and it works. It's an easily made plane. I've made wooden planes. I'll show you one tonight, actually. It works. It has its drawbacks. So, that being said, I guess I'll make one other sort of historical comment, and that is that this probably is like sawdust in my blood. My great-grandfather was a plane maker. He was apprenticed in Bristol, England, came over to the States around 1850, worked for Dosher in Saugatuck, Connecticut for a while, got married, moved to New Hartford, to the Pine Meadow section of New Hartford, and worked for Herman Chapin until his wife decided she didn't like Pine Meadow and went back to Westport. And he worked for Dosher until Dosher folded. And that was sometime in the early 20th century. So, that being said, I will now attempt to tell you about this array of tools that you see laid out in front of you. As I say, The first section of the table are the planes that you would find almost any craftsman would have in their toolbox. And they're called bench planes. They do what the term plane refers to. They are used to create a plane surface on a board. The early wooden ones were made in all kinds of different sizes, but basically there are 3 wooden planes that are important, and the sizes vary a little bit from manufacturer to manufacturer, from craftsman to craftsman, but they consist of a 4-plane, which is a medium-sized plane. It's used for roughing a board down to the size you want it and getting an approximately plane surface on it. It's going to have scallops in it. The iron is usually sharpened with a fair amount of camber to it, so it works sort of like a gouge. After the 4-plane, typically they would come by with a jointer, which is a much larger plane. It improves the flatness of the board just because it spans a bigger area, so it can't go follow ups and downs and hollows. That's the plane that generates the final plane surface. And then it would be finished with what's called a smooth plane, and that would typically be a plane like this, about this size. But these came in sizes that ran from this. This is a sort of a medium one. A very small version of this is sort of what we use as a block plane. This is called a coffin-sided smoother. You can see why it's coffin-sided. This is called a resi-handled smoother. I like it because it gets the hand down so you're pushing very effectively. But all of these wooden planes have a problem, and that is that the soles wear. And one of the things that makes a plane such an improvement over the chisel is this little piece out here in front that holds the wood down as the blade is cutting it, so that you don't get splits running out in front. And the key to making that work really well is to keep that gap very small. And as they wear, that gap always opens up because the escapement for the chips has to be wedge-shaped. And so as I start taking layers off of the sole here, the gap has to get bigger and bigger. And you find many old planes where they have been resold. That one? No, I guess not. That's just a wear spot on it. I have a couple in my collection. I don't think I brought any of them tonight, where they've put a new sole on it and recut the thing in order to close that up, because that's very, very important to a plane being able to do its job efficiently and well. The wooden planes were around through there were craftsmen who still used wooden planes probably as late as World War II even. By that time, electric tools had pretty much replaced hand tools in most people's toolboxes anyway. Outfits like Stanley started making metal planes about the time of the Civil War. Bailey's patent is 1860-something. Bailey's patent is the familiar metallic plane in this country.
Dick, what type of wood were the bodies normally made of?
In 17th and 18th century, you find some birch, but very shortly, American beech became the preferred material for the bodies. Okay, American beech would be used for the bodies. In places of high wear, it would be inlaid with boxwood. I'll show you some boxwood inlays as we work down the table here. Very seldom, you wouldn't find boxwood in pieces big enough to surface that sole. The boxwood is a shrub that grows in hedgerows, but it's a very, very hard and very stable wood, and so it's an ideal thing to put in places of high wear. So anyway, Stanley started making metal planes, about the time of the Civil War. Same thing, a 4-plane, just about the same size, used the same way. They made a larger range of sizes. This is a jack plane, which is basically a small four-plane. Some people would have only this plane, not a serious carpenter or a serious cabinet maker, but the jack plane is sort of a jack of all trades. It was made to be sort of intermediate between the long joiners and the smoothers. The joiner plane, this is a Stanley Bedrock. It's a little better than the typical Bailey, and the machining involved in seating the iron on a frog is a little bit more refined. It does a somewhat better job. And smooth planes. This is my first smooth plane. It's a Miller's Falls plane. It was purchased probably about the time I got out of college in 1965. One of my first paychecks. And this is another Stanley smooth plane. This is my favorite smoother for finishing surfaces. It's a Stanley 4.5, and it's a little wider, it's a little heavier than that, and I think it does a superb job of finishing surfaces. And you can produce a surface with this thing that doesn't need any sandpaper. In fact, I think sandpaper would degrade it. When you sand it, you always end up with a fuzzy surface. Yes?
Why do the metal ones have a knob on the front?
Place to put your hand and hold the front of it down.
Oh.
These are big enough that you can just do it like that. You don't need the knob.
I see.
Some of these are made with a knob, particularly European ones, ones that come from Europe. They'll have a tote like this at the back, and they'll have what they call a horn at the front, which is just sort of a projection that sticks up from the front of the plane that you can hook your thumb behind and do the same thing. The American design seldom went to that. You just use your hand on it. It's big enough and bulky enough that you can grab it. If you took the knob off of this thing, there's not much left there to get a hold of.
Mm-hmm.
And you really do want to keep the front end of that thing down. Now, the other thing that came with metal planes is the little thing called a scrub plane. And it's made for rapidly removing stock. If you have a 1-inch board and you need a 1/2-inch board, you can take a 1-inch board down to a 1/2-inch board fairly quickly with this thing. It's going to leave a pretty ragged, rough surface. You're playing across the grain with it. The iron is always very highly cambered. I don't know if you can see that or not, but you can come up and look at it later if you'd like. And it will take a 1/2-inch board down to, or an inch board down to a 1/2 inch fairly quickly. I think I did that when I did the demonstration on, well, I don't know, either joinery or the cabinet making. We used this plane. The pieces we were working with then were small. This plane wouldn't have made any sense on them. The piece was not as long as the sole of the plane, so there's no bandage. And so we didn't use anything that big. The smooth planes, Stanley made a whole line of planes. They started with a number 1. This is a number 2, and the number 1 is even smaller. I think the number 1 was mostly something that their salesmen carried in their kit to show, not to be used. They're very scarce. You don't find very many of them at all. They're very pricey. I've seen a couple of them at shows, and I shook my head and said, I can't afford that. It's not a plane that's going to be very practical for me. This thing is already too small for me to hold on to comfortably. Okay, and I guess that's where we'll leave off here on bench planes, and we'll move on to what I call joinery planes, planes that were predominantly made for producing joints. And there is where the metallic plane, or the other thing I guess I should mention is that very, very few wooden things that you would call a block plane ever appeared. They're small plane, they're a plane that's comfortable to use with one hand. They're used for all kinds of trimming, touch-up work. I have a variety of them here. But I've never seen anything in a wooden plane that sort of matches them. You see smaller versions of this, but never anything that's really comfortable to use one-handed. These, I can, This is one of my favorite little ones. I can drop it in my apron pocket, you know, and it's always available. You know, I use it, you know, multiple times almost through any project. This is another one that's not so common. It's a Stanley. It's not cast iron. It's got a folded steel sole. It's just a piece of sheet metal that's been folded up. And I like it out on the job because I can drop it in my apron pocket. If I drop it off a ladder, it's not going to break. If I drop one of these off a ladder, I'm likely to have a broken plane. Okay, joinery planes. Again, here's where the metal plane begins to show its mark. There were a few wooden joinery planes, and there are still some made, and I'll show you one of those in a minute. This one is that's not the one I want. This is a rabbet plane. It's used for producing a little notch in the edge of a board, like you might set the back of a cabinet into. It produces, if I can find it here, yeah, it produces that little notch in the edge of a board. And you set another piece into it so that when you put another board across here, it'd cover the end grain on one board. It's a very common joint that's used all the time. And this is the wooden plane that produces it. This particular one has a nicker, so it will work cross grain, not only with the grain, but you can, not only can you go with the grain like this, but you can also go across the grain, and the nicker scores the wood ahead of it so you don't get tear out back into the part of the wood that you're not trying to plane. So that's a rabbet plane, and
Excuse me, Dick, so the nicker is like, more or less like doing a dado? Could you do, like,
Yeah.
like a...
yeah, except it's a dado that is open at one end,
Yeah,
at the end of a board. Okay, that leads me to the next plane, which is this one. This is a dado plane, very similar to the rabbet plane, except it's got two nickers, one on each side.
Oh,
That's a 3/4 inch dado. When you push that across the board, it cuts that. It's made for going cross grain, perpendicular to the grain, like a housing to set a shelf and a set of bookshelves into. That's not the one that made that dado. But it's got two nickers. It's got an adjustable depth stop that you can crank down to limit how deep it goes. And the iron is skewed, which improves its performance working cross grain because it provides the shearing action along the grain, so it takes out very clean shavings. That's a set of match planes for making tongues and grooves on boards. This one produces the tongue. This one produces the groove. They're made in pairs usually. Sometimes the pairs are all on one stop like that, one in each direction. So you take the tongue, turn the board over, and turn the plane around and do the other. They're usually sized by the thickness of the board that the tongue and groove are centered on. So these are stamped as 1/2 inch, which means that on a 1/2 inch thick board, the tongue and groove would be in the middle. If you vary the thickness of the board, the tongue and groove are going to be moved to one side or the other. And they were made like that, which is very standard molding, or blank for a molder, but that's something you're likely to be doing all day if you're building a house or something. And so they were also made with a toe, which makes them much more comfortable to use and much more controllable, less blisters. And that was important. And that's a grooving plane. That's a matching top. Now sometimes you just want a groove and you don't want it centered on the edge of a board, but you want it somewhere in the middle. And that's what these guys are for. These are called plow planes. They're adjustable, so you can adjust the fence to put the groove, a ways in from the edge of a board, but they take out a shaving, and they came usually with sets of irons in various widths, and that's what determined the width of the groove that you plowed. They're made for working with the grain. And this is a handled version with what's called screw arms. This is a somewhat more primitive version, no handle. Just, you have to grab the thing here, and the adjustment for the fence is not screws, but you just slide it in and out and wedge it. A couple of wedges. To wedge that securely, you'd have to give it a tap. But they're both the same sort of plane. I kept them very parallel. The advantage of the screw ones is that it's a little easier to keep things parallel. You really do need to keep the fence parallel to the skate, or the plane will jam on you. I think that gets through the wooden. Oh no, this is a modern wooden plane. This is made in Germany by Ulma, and it's made for cutting the male half of a sliding dovetail. It's a sliding dovetail. The sliding dovetail is like that. Cuts a little sloping rabbet on the edge of the thing. And it gets housed in a mate, which is the female half of the sliding dovetail. And that was typically done in old days with just a saw, a back saw or something, and they would provide themselves with a fence or a guide for the saw, and just cut the two edges, and then take it out with a chisel or with a router plane. This is a metal router plane. I don't happen to have a wooden one. They were made, commonly called old woman's teeth. Because the cutter in it looks like somebody with just one tooth left in the front of their mouth. Why women? I don't know. You'll find it listed in catalogs like that. I guess we weren't so sensitive when wooden planes were in use. Anyway, that's a sliding dovetail plane, but that's a modern plane. That's made very early. But I'm sure they existed long before that one. I've never seen one I've never seen one in the wild. What I mean by in the wild is in an antique shop or in a museum or something. But I've seen them in books, and I've seen them in catalogs. I've even seen them in catalogs. Anyway. So we'll get to the metal stuff now. For every one of these wooden planes, there's a metal counterpart. This is one of Stanley's match planes. Remember I said you take two of them and you stick them together? You get one in one direction and one in the other. That's Stanley's version of it. They made these in three sizes. It centered the groove on probably 3/4, maybe half 3/4 in each boards. This is another Stanley match plane. It's called a swinging fence match plane. With the fence in that position, it cuts a groove. You pull the pin and swing the fence around. And now it cuts the top, or now it cuts the top.
What's the manufacturer of that one?
Stanley.
Stanley.
Most of these are Stanley's. I have planes from other companies too. I decided that was one more dimension than I wanted to put in the stock. I've got plenty of them already. Okay. This is a rabbet plane. This is a bench rabbet plane. It does the same thing that first plane that I showed over there. This is a smoother size. They also made one in the jack plane size, which I find very handy for timber framing. I use it a lot. I don't use this one near as much, but this is lighter, so I'm glad And, where are we going here? Oh, this is a modern dovetail plane. Stanley made these things in sizes from 1/4 inch to 1 inch by 1/8. This is a 3/4. I have a full set on my shelves. But it's the same thing as that wooden one, that second wooden one I showed you. It's got a depth gauge. It's got 2 knickers and a skew blade. You use it to cut that. That's not what cut it. This is a 3/4. That was probably cut with a 5/8 plane. To use it, you tack a guide strip on your piece and use that as a fence, because quite often you're cutting dados way out in the middle of the board, and so a fence attached to the plane gets very unwieldy, almost impossible to use. So you tack just a piece of scrap wood across one edge of the thing, and then use that to guide your plane to start. Once you got the dado started, it's self-guiding. That's a fixed dado plane. This is an adjustable dado plane. You can put different size irons in it, but you can vary the width of the dado that it cuts. Again, it's a Stanley plane.
Not that you want to, but what is it like the maximum depth? I'm sure you don't want to go very deep with them, but it's like,
Well,
they,
this one would probably cut 1 inch deep,
yeah, plenty, that's
which is plenty, you know.
Yeah.
Usually your dado is going to be cut in like a 3/4 inch or inch stop. If you're using it to build a bookcase, for instance, and want to house the ends of the
The
shelf.
deeper you go, the harder work it is too.
A little bit. You do gain some extra friction from the size of the skates, but you don't cut. These things are all multi-pass. You don't take anything out in one pass.
Oh.
The shavings are little fine curly things. Okay. The thing that you don't see very much, well, you do see a little bit. Where did I put them in the wrong slot. That's why I didn't get to them. There's one other set of wooden planes that were typically used for joinery. And that's these things, which are called side rabbet planes. Instead of planing the bottom of a rabbet or the bottom of a dado, they plane the side of it. The cutter is here along the side of the plane, not on the bottom. One will do a right-hand side and the other one will do the left-hand side. Okay, they were almost always sold in pairs. And that's another wooden plane that I should have put over here instead of over with the mortars. This is a modern version of the same plane. Again, this particular one is a double ender. So one side in this direction and the other side in this direction. They are also made as 2 separate planes. I have a set of the 2 separate ones at home too. I can't create an example of everything. This was heavy enough. But this is a Stanley, it's a side rabbet plane. And with a little modification, I add this little appendage to the depth gauge, and it now will cut the female half of my sliding dovetail. So,
Tricky.
okay, moving on. The thing that I don't see much of, well, this is a modern plane. It's called a chisel plane. I use it for leveling. Mostly I use it for cutting off glue squeeze out. But it will get up into a corner and trim up into a right angle corner. These were also available in wood, but Generally, they were improvised on the spot by cutting an angle on the front end of a block of wood and clamping a chisel to it. So I don't know if I've ever seen one in a catalog or not. Maybe I have. And the other thing that is modern, I've never seen in wooden planes are what are called shoulder planes. And this is that's one example of it. This is a bull-nosed example, essentially, of the same plane, both the same width, but this one will work up closer to the end of something than this one. In fact, you can take the front out of this thing and work right up to a corner, just like you can with the chisel plane. And they're used for fitting mortise and tenon joints, particularly trimming the shoulders of the tenon, which is the end grain. When you cut a tenon on the end of a piece of wood, you have a board, and you're going to cut a thinner board, and it's going to have a shoulder, which is the transition from the tenon out to the surfaces of the original wood. Getting those so that on a piece of furniture they fit exactly against the board that the mortise is in is somewhat of a chore, and that's what these planes do superbly. They're at low angles, so they cut end grain very efficiently, and they're solid. The base and the sides are machined square, and I've never seen that in a wooden plane, I don't think. This is a router plane. If you don't happen to have dado planes, or you need an extra wide dado that your dado planes don't do, you run a saw kerf down to the depth of the dado on both sides, and you can use this thing to clean out the center. It's also it's used for any time you want to level a surface below a surrounding surface. If you're trying to do a relief carving and you want to bring the background down, you can use this thing to do that. And this is a modern rabbet plane. It's made by a company up in Canada called, Veritas is the manufacturing arm of Lee Valley. Lee Valley is a tool purveyor up in Ottawa. Marvelous tools. Their manufacturing arm is excellent. They make some very nice stuff and some very innovative stuff. This is a modern rabbet plane. It's skewed, so it works cross grain or with the grain, has a fence, has a depth stop, got a nice heavy iron, and they come in pairs. You can buy one or you can buy the other if you're right or left-handed, or if you really do a lot of work, you really want to have both of them, because there are times when the grain is not going to cooperate with the handedness of your plane. You're going to need the plane from the other direction. I do have it's made at home as well. Once again, in the interest of not becoming too burdened tonight, I left it at home. Okay, so that takes care of much of the joinery work. I guess I should show you the epitome of that, and this will also infringe on the molding stuff. But this was not done by hand, I will admit that freely. It was done on machines, but I have done it by hand, and it can be done by hand. It's a window sash. It's probably one of the last two windows, replacement windows, that are going to go into our house. I hope that's the case anyway. I've done all the rest of them too. And it's made like a traditional window sash. The stuff is all cut with mortise and tenon together. The corners are all coped so that where this piece meets the molding on here, the inverse of that molding is cut on the end of here. I'll pass that around and people can take a look at it and see how it goes together. That's the traditional way of making window sashes. And Jake and I have been working on those for a couple of weeks now, but not very often. We've got maybe 12 hours into it so far, and we've just about finished two windows. That's just one of the upper sash. Okay, and when you do that by hand, you use a gadget called a sash plane, which cuts on one side the glass rabbet, on the other side the fancy little molding. And that does that all in one operation. And if you look, when you look at that window sash, you'll see that there's a glass rabbet on one side, which is the square rabbet, where the glass goes and gets puttied in, and on the other side there's like an OG molding. This thing, I think, is just a quarter round, and not an OG, but that cuts that all at once. It works very nicely. The way you make the cope on the ends of the pieces that are going to mate to it is with what's called a cope plane. This is a plane that I had to make to match the sash plane that I had. These are not recognized by dealers and stuff, many dealers. Not the dealers that I can afford. Those are the people who don't understand what the tools they have are. And so they don't tend to get saved. They're trivial little planes that, but that, the way you make the pieces that go in the interior of that thing is you start with a wide board. You cut it to the length you're going to need. Then you plane the cope across the full width. Then you rip it apart into strips and mold it.
Now you're saying you made that, okay, did you, did the machine, did the knives yourself, or?
I designed it to match that plane.
Yeah, but so you file down the knife, it's by,
Yep.
yeah, by hand, you know?
Grind, well, with a grinder.
Yeah, whatever, yeah.
If you look carefully, you'll see that there's a piece of fancy steel brazed to a piece of not so fancy steel in the iron.
Yeah, a little hardness, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Probably a piece of old one machinist gauge stuff.
Yeah.
So that's the sash plane, okay? But molders, that's a relatively, and that sort of spans between the joinery and the decorative stuff. So does this one, and I'll do this one next. This is my version of a panel raising plane. It's a rabbet plane that I've modified to do raised panels for like doors or wainscoting. It planes that little sloping surface between the tongue that sticks into the stiles and rails and the field in the center. And that plane does it. If this is my preferred way to do it. There were planes that were made specially to do that. This is one of them. And it did the whole thing in one operation. I have to use 2 operations to do that, but I get a different product out of it. This thing, when you use it, you get your raised panel, but the tapered section goes all the way to the edge of the board. And the problem with that is when you put your door together and things shrink a little bit, the panels rattle. So what I do is I plane a rabbet on the outside all the way around, so I have a constant thickness tongue all the way around, and then plane the slope to the field inboard of that, and that's why there's this fence offset from the cutting action that spans that rabbet. Ooh, thunder. Okay, that's joinery, and this last 2 things, you know, are sort of span the joinery and the decorative stuff. Decorative stuff are done with planes that are called planes by most people, but they're really, if you get fussy about it, are called molders. Okay? And molders came in two varieties, and the division between them is probably kind of arbitrary, but this is a set of what's called hollows and rounds. If you look at the, unfortunately, the best one to show you is the bottom one, because you'll be able to see it, but I'm not going to undo the stack. This one has a round sole and a round iron, and it planes a little convex groove. This one is its mate. In fact, it's exactly its mate. They're actually, each one is the mother plane of the other. Hollows and rounds are interesting. They're the only molders that are called by the shape of the plane, named by the shape of the plane rather than the shape that they produce. Most molders are named for the shape that they produce, not for the shape of the plane. Hollows and rounds never got the word, apparently. But they came in pairs. Each pair works a circle of a particular radius, and they usually span a 60-degree arc of the circle. And they came in pairs, graduated in sizes. Many of them were sold in sets of 9 pairs. And you can see them in the catalogs. This stack that I produced here just stacked up to about that high, of 9 pairs of these things. Again, you know, they're heavy, so I didn't bring them all. I do have a full set.
One aspect of that, okay, with Barry Butterfield, buddy of mine who's deceased, but when he made his canoes, he'd take strips of cedar
Mhm.
and
Use
he'd
up-
use it just where, in a way it'd be concave and it would,
Right,
then he'd put epoxy over it.
Right.
And
Yep.
it'd make a waterproof
Yep.
joint
those
also.
planes will do that job.
You know, you
Okay.
can, you'd be
They're better-
concave or convex, you know, so
Right.
you. Yeah.
Yep, yep. I've made canoes that way too.
Yeah.
There are better planes to do that. Simply that, a strip of that 1/4-inch stuff is really hard to keep one of those centered on.
Oh, yeah, definitely. No, he had a machine, huh? He didn't
Right.
do it.
But there are better, if you took one of these planes and put a fence on it, and you can do it by screwing a fence to the side, then you've got something to guide you and keep you centered on that piece of wood. Okay? But if you're just trying to use this plane, it's a
Lot of
little,
give there, yeah.
it's a little hard, because you're trying to follow a 1/4-inch thick piece of wood over like 16 feet.
So if each of those is the mother of the other one, which came first?
Some guy with a chisel. Okay, like I said, all of this stuff can, at least in principle, be done with a chisel. Okay, it may be a shaped chisel, it may be a gouge, not a straight chisel, but it can be done with a chisel. The others that are called simple beading planes, these are a pair of snipe bills, and they were often sold with this collection as well. And it's just a little tiny, fine end on it for cleaning out details, cleaning out little corners and stuff where the plane may have skipped, or you want to sharpen up a thing, or you want a little bit of undercut to sharpen up a molding. And they were often sold right in with the molders. There's not very many of them. They're hard to find because that little edge is delicate. And this is where I said I'd talk about boxwood inlay. The edge of this thing, you probably can't see it from there, but if you come up and look afterwards, there's an inlay strip in here. It's laid in at an angle so that it's not right at the edge. And that's made out of boxwood. Little pieces of boxwood laid in there and then shaped with the sole of the plane. And that provides the wear, the resistance that you need to keep these things functional. Okay, we're getting there. The last of the simple molders are beaters. These produce a little bead on the edge of a board. These are called edge beaters. This one does a 8/8, so it's an inch, 1 inch diameter, 1 inch bead. So the width of the entire thing. Here you can probably see the boxwood. That whole bead is a boxwood inlay. That was probably a fairly pricey plane. It was E&T ring. I can't read that. This is a small one. Again, they came in sets. This one does probably an 1/8-inch, 3/16 bead on the edge of a board, like you would see on, well, they call it beadboard now. Quite often it's masonite that's been molded that way. But in the house at Thousand Islands that you were at, the boards up there were all done, they were done by machine. That stuff happened, in the late 1800s in line shaft machinery. I have some of the line shaft machinery that may very well have made that beadboard in my shed at home. But when you started seeing, carpenter's gingerbread and beaded paneling and so on and so forth, that was because there were machines around to do it, unless you were very, very rich. The other melders are called complex molders. And they just do the same thing, but they do fancier stuff. Okay, this is an example of the output of a complex molder. In fact, it's an example of the output of this. Oh, come on. Oh, there we go. It's the output of that plane.
Once on each side, right?
No, the one on the other side is the output of this plane. Another complex molder. And they just did, you know, fancier stuff. The one thing probably the thing that most completely sets the complex molders apart from the simple molders, that complex molders are almost always what's called sprung. And that means that you don't use it perpendicular to the surface or parallel to the edge or anything like that. They're always used at an angle. They're always made at an angle.
Now, you follow that with a jig to keep that consistent?
No, it's pretty much self-jigging.
Oh, is it?
It's got a fence and a gauge that stops it.
Well,
Okay, it'll pretty much jig itself. The reason it's done is if I just tried to keep this thing parallel to the surface, I'd have a very narrow throat here, and I'd have a very wide throat up here at the highest, the deepest point, because of the shape of the escapement.
so the depth, when you turn around, the longest point right there, that's your depth, right there?
Mm-hmm.
Right there, at the bottom?
Yep, this sets the depth. See, there's no cutter over here.
Okay, yeah,
So when
right.
that contacts the surface, it stops.
Right,
Okay, and it's guided by a little fence along this edge.
right.
So,
Pretty,
okay,
it looks laborious.
but if I didn't spring it, then, as I say, I'd have a very narrow throat here, which is good for making nice fine shavings and nice smooth work. And down here, however, I'd have a very wide throat. So you spring it to minimize the distance from a parallel. The spring is set so that if you drew a pair of parallel lines that encompassed the highest and lowest points on this, that was the closest you could be able to get those lines together in order to encompass both the high and low points on the cutter. That minimizes the variation in mouth across the width. This is just another example of a complex molder. I don't have a piece that was produced by it. But it's very similar to the first one I showed you. Just a slightly different size. Okay.
Do you use these planes or are you a collector?
Both.
It comes in handy once in a while.
More than once in a while. I use them probably more than you might think. Well, while we're talking about molders, here. That was done by hand. I'll pass it around with a collection of those planes. The OG part was done with hollows and rounds. The convex in the center was done with hollows and rounds. These were done with beaters.
So this is molding.
That's molding. That's the window casings in my house.
There you go.
That was all done with hand planes.
The
Okay?
molding in the house wasn't all done with hand planes, but that piece was.
That piece was done with hand planes. We wanted-
This is number 4. If you come up missing number 4,
Before we went out and paid $175 for a set of molding knives for a molder, for a machine molder, I wanted to be sure that she liked it.
there you go.
So, but that was cut with hand planes. This was cut with a machine.
And this is 10 times faster.
Maybe even more than that.
Yeah, probably more than that. Well, less laborious, too.
Much easier just.
This would be a little too expensive to buy.
Pardon?
This would be a little too expensive to buy a few hundred feet.
I don't think I could buy
I guess
it.
so.
No, if you were to make it.
If you were to make it, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
To
That-
buy it on the open market?
Well, I don't think you would find it. That's my own design. I didn't copy that out of anywhere.
There's a guy down
I
at
took
Catatuck.
elements of different moldings that we liked and combined them myself.
They give them the profile, they can duplicate the profile of them,
This one seems like this one.
They match pretty good, don't they?
What did the cutter cost you?
$175 for a pair of them.
And that was 30 years ago, 20 years ago.
It would be a little expensive now.
Yeah, but, you know, if you're doing a whole house for it, it's not that bad. You know, you go out and buy just plain ordinary molding with no fancy on it.
That's pretty expensive.
That's pretty expensive too. You know, I felt perfectly justified in doing it this way. You know, this was oak that I bought for 75 cents a foot, green off DeLoss Robinson's mill. Seasoned it myself and, okay? So, anyway, all of this stuff, and this is a place where metal planes never went. All these molders. Except, Stanley, as their usual inventive fashion, produced two planes that did moldings. One was a Stanley 45, like this, and it was sold with a set of cutters. Would do plow, would do beading, both side and center beading. This is more plow. It would also do tongue and groove, and you could buy an extra cutter for it that would do, not the cope, but the sticking for sash and for doors. The limitation of the 45 is that both sides of whatever you're cutting have to be at the same depth. The cutter spans the two skates, which are adjustable in width, but the cutter has to rest on those two skates, one on each side. And so it has to have the profile you're cutting has to have the same depth on both sides of the cutter. Back, you said the chip breaker. I didn't even talk about that tonight. There's a lot of things that go into making a plane work really well. This, did I bring it? Yeah, this is probably the first plane I ever owned. There was a box of tools that my dad gave me for Christmas one year. It's not a toy tool, it's a real tool, but it's an abomination. Okay, I mean, he like myself, you know, toy tools are the best way in the world to turn somebody off.
Was your father a carpenter?
No, he was an engineer. But
Was your grandfather a carpenter?
But his dad built a boat.
But my dad built a boat. My dad
He built a
learned
cabin
woodworking.
cruiser.
Learned woodworking in high school shop from an old German cabinet maker in Rochester. And he was a woodworker all his life. You know, there was always a pile of sawdust in the basement, and that was my playpen. Yeah. Even when I wasn't supposed to be down there, and even using tools I wasn't supposed to be using. Yeah. I nearly cut my thumb off once when I were away at something or other. It was all I could do to cover the blood and keep it hidden until it healed. But this is a very simple plane. I can make it work now, but I couldn't then because it's difficult to adjust. There's no adjustment mechanism on it for either in and out or up and down. And when you lock the blade, you know, you have to loosen the blade to be able to adjust it. When you locked it down, it moved,
Yeah.
Right.
and it just was
Wouldn't
impossible.
go back in straight.
Yeah, it
It
was
always looked
always,
cocky.
yep, always.
Yeah.
You know, today I can adjust it and make it work, but then I couldn't. And, you know, it's only the fact that I could go to the cabinet and get one of his planes and use it instead of
was
this
made
that I didn't get so sick of
inexpensively.
this stuff that I never did any more of it.
It was made inexpensively?
Yeah. It says made in the USA. This was probably in the late 40s. You know, shortly after the war, probably. You know.
Very good.
But, you know, I brought that just because, you know, it is the first plane I ever owned.
Made by the play school?
No, that's a real plane. It was
Fisher
made,
Price?
it was probably made by,
My father's got one very similar to it. I know.
yeah, it was
Very
probably,
similar.
made by somebody, you know, something the equivalent of breakneck or something.
Yeah,
You know,
but I know they're not functional, you know.
well, I can, you know, as I say, I can make it function, but it's not worth the effort when I have to do it.
Okay.
Well, thank you,
But
Dick.
when I
Yeah,
teach my
very
boat
good.
building class up at the river, you know,
Yeah.
we supply everybody with a kit of tools. And I have to argue long and hard, you know, don't buy the cheapest tool you can find, because
Yeah.
you're just gonna frustrate people.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing you wanna do. You want them to go away from here and tell everybody what a great experience they had, so their friends will come next year.
And then they have that tool many years down the line because it's still functional.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I spend half my time when I'm teaching that class sharpening tools.
Well, thank you, Dick, and I
You're
know
welcome.
he brought a bunch of books you can look at.
Yeah, there are books laid out here,
Yeah.
and please help yourself. Feel free to pick this stuff up. Be a little careful of the wooden planes. I think I tapped everything tight. I store them on the shelf with the wedges loose. And when you pick it up, if you're not aware, the iron can drop out. And that's why it's not a particularly beautiful covering, but I didn't really want to see one of those irons dig up one of these nice oak tables.
Well, thank you. We have our refreshments here, if anyone cares to indulge.
I do have quite a little collection myself. I mean, just like between my father and my grandfather. Both my grandfathers.
Some of these.
Like, one I got like this.
Strange winter, huh?